Commander Jake Morrison stood on the bridge of the Terra Nova and watched the stars streak past the viewport. His crew had been traveling through deep space for 3 months now, and they were farther from Earth than any human had ever gone before. The ship hummed with the steady rhythm of its faster-than-light. Engines and everything seemed normal until it suddenly was not. The navigation officer, Lisa Chen, looked up from her console with wide eyes and her hands moved quickly across the controls. She said the ship was slowing down, but she had not given any such command. The chief engineer, Danny Sullivan, checked his readings and confirmed that something was pulling them out of faster-than-light travel. Jake ordered everyone to their stations, and the crew moved with practiced efficiency, even though fear was clear on their faces. The Terra Nova dropped back into normal space, and what they saw made everyone fall silent. A structure floated before them that was so massive it made their ship look like a toy. It stretched for hundreds of kilometers in every direction, and its surface was covered with lights and symbols that hurt to look at for too long. The metal, or whatever it was made from, seemed to shift colors as they watched it, and Jake knew immediately that this was not something humans had built. Before anyone could say anything, a beam of light shot out from the structure and surrounded their ship. Danny shouted that they were being pulled in, and his hands flew over the engine controls, but nothing responded. The Terra Nova moved toward the massive structure whether they wanted to or not, and Jake told his crew to stay calm even though his own heart was racing. Medical Officer Karen Price gripped her seat as the ship passed through what looked like a solid wall but turned out to be some kind of energy field. They found themselves in a chamber so large that clouds could have formed inside it. The Terra Nova was not alone here because dozens of other ships floated nearby, and each one looked completely different from the others. Some were organic and seemed to breathe, while others were geometric shapes that should not have been able to fly. Jake realized they were looking at ships from different alien species, and the thought made his mouth go dry. A voice spoke inside their heads without using sound, and it welcomed them to the Galactic Council. Jake grabbed his head because the sensation was deeply uncomfortable, and he saw his crew doing the same thing. The voice said that humanity had been summoned to answer for their crimes, and they would be transported to the council chamber immediately. Before Jake could protest, the bridge dissolved around them, and suddenly they were standing in an enormous room. The floor was made of something that looked like crystal, and 12 massive beings sat in a circle around them. Each one was completely different, and Jake could not even begin to describe what he was seeing. One looked like it was made of living crystal that refracted light in impossible ways. Another seemed to be made of pure energy contained in a vaguely humanoid shape. A third had too many limbs and eyes, and its body kept shifting as though it could not decide what form to take. The crystalline being spoke, and this time the words came out loud even though Jake could see it had no mouth. It called itself the Speaker of the Council, and said that the Council had maintained order across the galaxy for over 50,000 years. It said that thousands of species lived under their guidance and protection, and all of them obeyed the laws that kept peace throughout the stars. Jake found his voice and asked what crime humanity had committed. The speaker's body pulsed with light, and it said that humans had developed faster-than-light travel without authorization. It explained that all emerging species must petition the Council for permission before they could leave their home systems, and humanity had broken this fundamental law. Lisa stood close to Jake and whispered that they had not known about any such law, because no one had ever told them. The speaker said that ignorance was not an excuse, and the law had been in place for millennia before humans even existed. It continued speaking and laid out what humanity must do to avoid punishment. They must submit to council authority immediately and place all government functions under council oversight. They must dismantle every military vessel and weapon system they had built. They must accept limits on how many children could be born each year and how many resources they could take from their own planet. They must also provide 10% of everything Earth produced as tribute to the Council. Jake felt anger rise in his chest, and he said that humanity would never accept such terms. The speaker's light grew brighter, and it said that every species said the same thing at first, but they all learned to obey eventually. It explained that the Council had vast fleets and weapons beyond human understanding, and resistance was pointless. The speaker said humanity had 7 Earth days to comply, and after that the Council would take more direct action. Danny stepped forward and asked what gave the Council the right to make such demands. One of the other Council members spoke for the first time, and its voice sounded like grinding metal. It said that might and age gave them the right, and they had been traveling the stars when humanity's ancestors were still living in caves. The Council had brought peace to countless worlds and prevented wars that would have destroyed entire civilizations. They were not tyrants but guardians who kept order in a chaotic universe. Karen asked what would happen if humanity refused, and the speaker said their world would be placed under quarantine first. Ships would surround Earth and nothing would be allowed to leave or enter. If humanity continued to resist, then the Council would begin destroying their cities one by one until they learned obedience. The speaker said this had never been necessary before because all species eventually saw a reason, but the option was available if needed. Jake looked at his crew and saw the same anger and fear that he felt reflected in their eyes. He turned back to the Council and said that he would take their message to Earth's leaders, but he could not promise they would accept. The speaker said it did not care what promises were made because the outcome was inevitable. Humanity would bow to the Council just like every other species had done. The chamber dissolved and Jake and his crew found themselves back on the bridge of the Terra Nova. The massive structure was gone and they floated in empty space once more. Danny immediately began plotting a course back to Earth while Lisa contacted their command center to warn them what was coming. Jake sat in his command chair and tried to process what had just happened. The trip back to Earth took 3 weeks and every day felt longer than the last. Jake spent hours writing his report and trying to find words that would make the world's leaders understand what they were facing. When they finally entered Earth's orbit, Jake saw that ships from every nation were already gathering, and everyone had been preparing for something even though they did not know what. He was transported immediately to an emergency council session where President Helen Carter and leaders from around the world waited to hear what he had found. Jake stood before them and explained everything the council had said and the impossible choice they now faced. Some leaders argued for compliance and said that fighting was suicide. Others, including General Frank Hayes, said that accepting the council's terms was the same as slavery and humanity should resist no matter the cost. President Carter listened to everyone speak, and then she looked at Jake and asked what he thought they should do. Jake took a deep breath and said that the council believed they ruled everything, but maybe it was time someone taught them they were wrong. The room erupted in arguments, but Jake could see that a decision had already been made in the president's eyes. Humanity had 7 days to choose between submission and war, and Jake knew which path they would take because humans had never been good at bowing to anyone. The council's observation probes arrived at Earth on the 3rd day after Jake Morrison had delivered their ultimatum. The small silver spheres positioned themselves around the planet and began transmitting everything they saw back to the council chambers. What they recorded confused the ancient beings who watched from across the galaxy because humanity was not preparing to surrender, but instead they were building weapons at a pace that seemed impossible. Every factory on Earth had converted to military production, and ships were being launched from orbital yards that had been completed in just days. The council members watched this activity with something close to amusement because they had seen this response before from other species. It was always the same pattern where the young races would thrash and struggle before accepting reality. The speaker told the other council members that humanity's resistance would collapse the moment they saw real power. What the council did not understand and could not have understood was that humanity had spent its entire existence at war. Every human civilization had been built on conflict and competition, and even now when they faced an outside threat, the different nations of Earth argued about tactics and strategies. Other species had reached the stars through cooperation and centuries of peace, but humans had developed faster than light, travel while still fighting among themselves, over borders and resources and old grudges that should have been forgotten generations ago. Danny Sullivan worked in a laboratory deep beneath the surface of Earth, and around him were engineers from a dozen different countries. They were taking apart every piece of technology that the Terra Nova had recorded during its encounter with the council structure. Danny had always been good at understanding how things worked, and he could see patterns in the alien technology that others missed. He noticed that the council's ships all used similar power signatures and that their weapons were designed more for intimidation than actual damage. Another facility, Dr. Peter Griffin and Dr. Amy Wallace were studying something even more important. They had been examining the way the council's voice had spoken directly into human minds. and they discovered something remarkable. The neural patterns in human brains were different from what the Council expected. Where other species thought through problems in linear logical steps, humans could make intuitive leaps that seemed to come from nowhere. Amy called it creative chaos, and Peter said it meant humans could innovate in ways the Council had never encountered. Jake Morrison spent his time studying everything the Terra Nova had recorded about the Council and their technology. He watched the recordings of the 12 beings over and over, and he noticed something that made him smile despite the situation. The Council members had moved with absolute confidence, but there was no tension in their postures and no awareness of threat. They had been at peace for so long that they had forgotten what it meant to face an enemy who actually wanted to fight. Lisa Chen was working with military commanders from around the world, and together they were developing tactics for space combat. She pulled strategies from naval warfare and aerial dogfights and even ancient battles fought with swords and shields. The Council would expect logical, predictable movements, because that was how civilized species fought. But Lisa was planning something else entirely. She told the commanders that they needed to think like pirates and guerrillas and terrorists because honorable combat was a luxury they could not afford. General Frank Hayes stood before a holographic display that showed Earth, surrounded by defensive positions. He had spent 40 years in the military, and he knew that every battle came down to simple mathematics about firepower and position. The Council had more ships and better weapons, but Hayes had fought against superior forces before. He told his staff that the key was making the enemy commit to bad positions and then hitting them where they were weak. President Helen Carter addressed the world on the 6th day, and her speech was broadcast to every screen and radio on the planet. She said that humanity had been given a choice between freedom and slavery, and the choice was an easy one. She explained that the Council believed their age and power gave them the right to rule over others, but humanity had fought against tyranny before, and they would do it again. Carter said that the next days would be hard, and many would die, but their children would live free or they would not live at all. The Council's deadline arrived and passed, and humanity's answer was silence. The speaker convened the Council and said that the time for mercy had ended. It ordered a small enforcement fleet of 12 ships to travel to Earth and demonstrate what happened to species who refused to obey. The Council members agreed that this would be sufficient, because no emerging species had ever withstood even a single Council warship. The enforcement fleet arrived at Earth 3 days later, and their commander broadcast a message demanding immediate surrender. Jake Morrison was now in command of Earth's defensive forces, and he responded by launching every ship humanity had ready. The Council commander watched 53 human vessels approach his 12 ships, and he felt something close to pity because this was going to be a massacre. The battle began and immediately went wrong for the Council forces. The human ships did not form neat battle lines or follow predictable patterns. Instead, they swarmed like insects and attacked from every angle at once. 3 human ships rammed directly into a Council vessel and detonated their reactors in suicide runs that Danny Sullivan had designed specifically for this purpose. The Council commander tried to regroup his forces, but Lisa Chen had predicted every move and human ships were already in position to exploit each formation. Karen Price watched the battle from a medical station on Earth's surface, and she saw the casualty reports coming in. Hundreds of humans were dying, but the Council ships were dying too. One of the massive alien vessels broke apart under sustained fire from 8 human ships that had coordinated their weapons in a way the Council's shields could not handle. Another Council ship tried to retreat, but Ryan Torres led a squadron that cut off its escape and pounded it until it went dark. The battle lasted 4 hours, and when it ended, 11 Council ships were destroyed or crippled. Only one escaped by making an emergency jump to faster than light speed. Earth had lost 28 ships and over 3,000 people were dead, but humanity had won. Jake stood on the bridge of his command ship and looked at the debris field floating in space. He knew this was just the beginning, but they had proven something important. News of the battle spread across the galaxy through the Council's own communication networks. Species that had lived under Council rule for thousands of years heard that someone had actually defeated their enforcers. On a world called Zentara, the people watched recordings of the battle and whispered to each other about what it might mean. On another world, the Dreth hive mind processed the information and began calculating possibilities it had never considered. Before, the Council convened in emergency session, and for the first time in living memory, the members were afraid. The speaker's crystalline body pulsed with angry red light, and it demanded to know how primitive humans had destroyed trained council forces. Other members argued that this was a fluke, and that overwhelming force would crush humanity easily. A few voices suggested negotiation, but they were shouted down by those who said the council's authority could not be questioned. They decided to mobilize a real military force and pull ships from reserves that had not been used in centuries. The council would assemble 300 vessels, and officers were called up who had never fought an actual battle, but had studied tactics in simulations. They would go to Earth and they would burn it until humanity begged for mercy. The speaker announced that the fleet would depart in 30 days, and this time there would be no survivors to spread tales of resistance. On Earth, humanity watched the skies and prepared for what was coming. Danny worked on new weapons, and Lisa developed new tactics, and Karen prepared hospitals for casualties that would number in the millions. Jake met with President Carter and General Hayes, and they all knew that the next battle would be much harder. They had surprised the council once, but surprise would not work a second time. But something else was happening that the council did not notice. On Zentara and other worlds, messages were being sent through secret channels. Species that had been silent for millennia were asking questions and making contact with each other. They wanted to know if the humans needed help and what it would take to fight back. The council had ruled through fear for 50,000 years, but fear was a fragile thing, and once it cracked, it could shatter completely. Jake stood on the observation deck of Earth's largest space station and looked up at the stars. Somewhere out there, 300 council ships were preparing to come and destroy everything he loved. But also out there were other species who were watching and waiting and hoping. Humanity had shown that the council could bleed, and sometimes that was all it took to start a revolution. The news of humanity's victory spread through the galaxy faster than the council could contain it. On thousands of world species that had lived under council rule for generations suddenly had hope that maybe the ancient powers were not as invincible as they claimed. The council members met in their chamber, and the anger in the room was thick enough to feel. The speaker's crystalline form glowed with red light, and it declared that humanity would be made an example that would echo through history for the next 10,000 years. The council began mobilizing its military forces and pulling ships from reserves that had been in storage for centuries. They called up officers who had trained in simulations but never fought a real battle because there had been no real battles to fight. The council's member species contributed vessels and crew, but many did so reluctantly because they were starting to question whether this war was necessary. 300 ships gathered at a staging point far from Earth, and their commander was a being called Mordax, who had lived for over 2,000 years and believed absolutely in the council's right to ruled on Earth. Humanity prepared for what everyone knew would be a much harder fight. Jake Morrison had been promoted to admiral and given command of all defensive forces. He worked 20-hour days coordinating between different nations and trying to build a unified command structure from militaries that had been enemies just months before. Every nation contributed what ships they could, and the orbital yards worked around the clock building new vessels from Danny Sullivan's improved designs. Lisa Chen spent her time developing tactics that might give them a chance against overwhelming numbers. She studied every battle in human history, looking for examples of smaller forces defeating larger ones. She found patterns in the victories of ancient generals and modern commanders, and she began to understand that the key was always making the enemy fight on your terms, not theirs. Lisa gathered the fleet captains and explained her plans, and some of them thought she was crazy, but they agreed to follow her lead because she had been right before. Danny worked with engineers from around the world to build weapons that the council would not expect. He designed missiles that could split into dozens of smaller warheads and mines that could disguise themselves as debris and energy weapons that could overload the council's shield frequencies. Karen Price prepared medical facilities and trained thousands of doctors and nurses for the casualties that would come. She knew that this battle would be worse than the last one, and the hospitals would overflow with the wounded and dying. General Hayes coordinated ground defenses because everyone knew some council ships would get through to Earth's surface. He positioned anti-aircraft batteries and shield generators and evacuation centers in every major city. Hayes walked through the streets of Washington and saw people going about their lives with forced normalcy, because what else could they do but live until they could not anymore? President Carter addressed the United Nations, and told the assembled leaders that this was humanity's moment of truth. She said that every species in the galaxy was watching to see if humans would stand or fall. Carter explained that even if they lost this battle, they would have shown that the Council could be resisted, and that alone might be enough to change everything. The representatives voted unanimously to continue the fight, and Carter signed orders that put Earth on total war footing. The Council fleet arrived at Earth. After a 3-week journey through faster-than-light space, Mordax looked at the planet on his display and felt contempt for the primitive beings who dared to challenge Council authority. He saw 75 human ships moving to intercept his 300, and he ordered his fleet to form standard battle lines. Mordax sent a final message to Earth demanding surrender and promising that if they submitted now, he would only destroy their military capabilities and spare their cities. Jake received the message aboard his flagship, and he looked at his bridge crew. Lisa was at the tactical station, and Danny was monitoring the weapon systems, and they both nodded at him. Jake sent a 2-word response to Mordax that consisted of an ancient human insult, and then he ordered the fleet to attack. The human ships accelerated toward the Council forces, and Mordax smiled, because this would be over quickly. The battle began, and immediately the Council forces realized something was wrong. The human ships did not engage in formation, but scattered in every direction like they were fleeing. Mordax ordered pursuit, and his ships broke their neat lines to chase the humans. That was exactly what Lisa had planned, because now the Council fleet was spread out and vulnerable. 3 human ships that had appeared to flee suddenly reversed course and fired everything they had at a Council vessel that had gotten separated from its support. The ship's shields held against the first barrage, but then Danny's new missiles arrived and split into cluster munitions that overwhelmed the defenses from every angle. The Council ship went dark and began tumbling through space. Mordax tried to reform his fleet, but the humans kept hitting isolated ships and then running before reinforcements could arrive. Ryan Torres led a squadron that pretended to be damaged and limping away. When Council ships moved to finish them off, they flew directly into a minefield that Danny had deployed hours before. The explosions destroyed 4 Council vessels and crippled 2 more. Karen watched the battle from Earth and saw the tactical displays showing ships dying on both sides. The human casualties were mounting, and she knew that every red dot on her screen represented dozens of people who would never come home. The hospitals were already receiving wounded from ships that had taken damage, and Karen moved through the wards, trying to save as many as she could. The battle raged for 6 hours, and the space around Earth became a graveyard of burning ships and floating debris. Mordax had lost over 40 vessels, and he could not understand how this was happening. His forces had superior numbers and technology, but the humans fought with a desperation and creativity that his training simulations had never prepared him for. They used ramming attacks and false retreats and suicide runs and dozens of other tactics that civilized species considered dishonorable. Jake's flagship took a direct hit that nearly tore it in half, and emergency systems barely kept the crew alive. He transferred his command to another ship and continued directing the battle, even though he could taste blood in his mouth from internal injuries. Lisa's console showed that they had lost 32 ships, but the Council had lost many more. She calculated that if they could hold out for another few hours, the Council fleet would have to withdraw or risk total destruction. Mordax made a decision that would haunt the galaxy. He ordered his ships to target Earth's surface and begin orbital bombardment of human cities. If he could not win a clean victory, then he would terrorize humanity into submission. Council ships that had held back from the main battle suddenly opened fire on the planet below, and their weapons burned through the atmosphere to strike at population centers. The city of Mumbai was hit first, and millions died in seconds as energy beams vaporized entire neighborhoods. Shanghai and Cairo and Mexico City followed, and the death toll climbed into the tens of millions. Karen screamed at her screens as the hospital she was working in shook from a near miss. General Hayes watched from his command bunker as his defensive batteries tried to shoot down the incoming fire, but there were too many targets and not enough weapons. Jake saw what was happening, and he made a terrible choice. He ordered every human ship to abandon tactics and formation and just attack with everything they had. The fleet charged directly at the Council ships that were bombarding Earth, and they fired and rammed and exploded in desperate attempts to stop the slaughter. Human ships died by the dozen, but they were taking Council vessels with them. Ryan Torres flew his crippled fighter directly into the bridge of a council ship that was targeting Los Angeles. The explosion destroyed both vessels, but it saved millions of lives. Dozens of other pilots followed his example, and Mordax watched in horror as humans threw away their lives without hesitation to protect their world. He had never seen anything like it. Because council species valued survival above all else, the battle reached its climax when Lisa identified Mordax's flagship and directed 20 human ships to concentrate all fire on that single target. The council commander's shields failed under the sustained assault, and his ship began breaking apart. Mordax sent a final message to his fleet ordering them to retreat and preserve themselves for future battles. The council ships that could still move jumped to faster than light speed and fled the system. The battle was over, and humanity had won again, but the victory felt hollow. 73 cities had been damaged or destroyed, and over 200 million people were dead. The human fleet had lost 51 ships out of 75, and the survivors were barely functional. Jake sat in his command chair and looked at the casualty reports, and he wondered if they could survive another victory like this one. But across the galaxy, something had changed. Species that had watched the battle saw that the Council was willing to commit genocide to maintain its power. They also saw that humanity had fought against impossible odds and won. The seeds of rebellion that had been planted after the first battle now began to grow into something larger. On Zentara and a dozen other worlds, secret meetings were held and plans were made. The Council had ruled for 50,000 years, but their time was ending and everyone could feel it. The Council sat in emergency session, and for the first time in recorded history, they faced open rebellion from multiple species at once. The footage of their forces bombing Earth cities had spread across every communication network in the galaxy, and the brutality had shocked species that had believed the Council was benevolent. On Zentara, the people gathered in massive crowds and demanded their government withdraw from the Council. Similar protests erupted on 17 other worlds, and the Council's authority was crumbling faster than they could respond. Jake Morrison stood in a secure facility deep underground on Earth, and across from him sat a being that looked like a mixture between an insect and a reptile. This was Ambassador Vekran of the Zenthari people, and he had traveled in secret to meet with humanity's leaders. Vekran explained that his people had been forced into the Council 2,000 years ago, and they had resented it every day since. He said that dozens of species felt the same way, but none had dared to resist until they saw what humanity had done. President Carter joined the meeting along with General Hayes, and together they listened as Vekran laid out a proposal. The Zenthari had industrial capacity that dwarfed Earth's production, and they were willing to build ships for a combined fleet. Other species had agreed to contribute as well, including the Dreth, who had massive population numbers, and the Corvani, who controlled key trade routes and communication networks. What they needed from humanity was military expertise and the courage to keep fighting. Jake asked why the Zenthari and others had not rebelled before if they hated the Council so much. Vekran's alien features could not smile, but his voice carried sadness as he explained that his people had forgotten how to fight. They had lived under Council rule for so long that warfare had become something from ancient history. The younger generations did not even understand the concept of organized violence, and the old warriors had died centuries ago. He said that humanity was unique because they had reached the stars while still knowing how to make war. Lisa Chen was assigned to work with alien military commanders and teach them human tactical doctrine. She stood in a training facility on Zentara and looked at the assembled officers from 7 different species. Some had 4 arms and others had wings, and one was essentially a floating cloud of gas held together by electromagnetic fields. Lisa began with basic concepts like flanking maneuvers and concentration of force, and she quickly realized that these ideas were completely foreign to beings who had lived in peaceful societies for generations. The Zenthari officers struggled with the concept of acceptable losses because their culture valued every individual life above strategic objectives. Lisa explained that in war you sometimes had to sacrifice a few to save many, and the aliens looked at her with something like horror. She showed them recordings of human battles throughout history and pointed out how commanders had made terrible choices that ultimately led to victory. The alien officers watched in silence as human armies charged into certain death to achieve their goals. Danny Sullivan traveled to a Dreth manufacturing world and worked with their engineers to combine human weapons with alien technology. The Dreth were hive-minded beings who thought and moved as one organism, and Danny found their collective intelligence both fascinating and useful. They could solve problems by having millions of minds work on different aspects simultaneously. Together, they designed hybrid ships that had human, offensive capabilities and alien defensive systems that were far superior to anything Earth could build alone. General Hayes found himself training an army of beings who had never held weapons before. The Corvani were bird-like creatures who moved with grace and speed but had no concept of military discipline. Hayes put them through basic training and watched as they struggled with simple commands like holding formation or following orders without debate. He realized that humanity's advantage was not just technology or tactics, but something deeper in their nature that made them natural. Warriors Karen Price worked with alien medical personnel to prepare for the casualties that would come. The different species had wildly different biologies, and she had to learn which treatments worked for which races. A Xanthari could survive injuries that would kill a human instantly, but they were vulnerable to toxins that humans could process easily. Karen created medical protocols that could handle wounded from a dozen different species, and she trained staff to work in the chaos of combat. Surgery. Nicole Sanders became humanity's diplomatic officer, and her job was to coordinate between species that had never worked together before. She spent her days mediating disputes and finding compromises between cultures that had completely different values and goals. The Xanthari wanted guarantees that civilian populations would be protected, while the Dreth saw no difference between military and civilian targets because their entire species was essentially one organism. Nicole had to explain human concepts like rules of engagement and war crimes to beings who found the entire idea of regulated violence absurd, the free species. Alliance grew to include 37 different races, and they began calling themselves simply the Alliance. They held their first joint military exercise in a system far from Council space, and the results were mixed at best. Ships from different species had trouble coordinating because they used different communication protocols and tactical frameworks. A Xanthari captain would give an order expecting immediate obedience, while a human captain expected their crew to use initiative. The Dreth moved in perfect synchronization, but could not adapt when plans changed unexpectedly. Jake watched the exercise from his flagship, and he saw all the problems clearly, but he also saw potential. Each species brought different strengths, and if they could learn to work together, they might actually have a chance. He called a meeting of all the Alliance commanders and explained that they needed to stop thinking like separate militaries and start thinking like one unified force. The alien commanders agreed in principle, but actually implementing that idea would take time they might not have. The Council was not idle during this time, and they were gathering forces from across their territory. Species that remained loyal contributed ships and resources, and the Council began building a fleet that would dwarf anything they had sent before. The speaker announced that the Council would crush the rebellion at Zentara Prime and use that victory to terrorize any other species that might be considering resistance. Over 2,000 Council ships gathered at a rally point, and their commanders were given orders to show no mercy. Lisa received intelligence about the Council's plans from Corvani spies who had infiltrated the enemy communication networks. She brought the information to Jake, and they both knew this was the moment that would decide everything. If the Alliance lost at Zentara, then the rebellion would collapse and every species that had joined them would face extermination. If they won, then the Council's authority would be broken forever, and the galaxy would be free. President Carter contacted Jake through a secure channel and asked him if humanity should commit their remaining forces to defend an alien world. Jake thought about the 200 million humans who had died in the last battle, and the cities that were still burning on Earth's surface. He thought about what it meant to be human, and why they had fought in the first place. Jake told Carter that if they only defended Earth, then they were no better than the Council who only cared about their own power. He said that freedom had to mean something larger than just humanity, or it meant nothing at all. The Alliance began moving forces to Zentara, and ships from 37 species converged on the system. Jake commanded 800 vessels, which was far more than humanity had ever fielded before, but still less than half of what the Council was bringing. General Hayes prepared ground defenses on Zentara's surface in case the orbital battle went badly. Karen set up field hospitals that could handle the massive casualties they expected. Danny made final adjustments to the hybrid weapon systems and prayed they would be enough. Ryan Torres led a reconnaissance mission to observe the Council fleet as it moved towards Zentara. What he saw made his blood run cold, because the enemy force was larger than intelligence had predicted. Over 2,000 ships moved in perfect formation, and their commanders clearly intended to win through overwhelming force. Ryan transmitted his data back to Jake and included a personal message saying that this was going to be bad, and they all knew it. Lisa worked on battle plans, but every simulation showed the Alliance losing badly. The numbers just did not work, and even with surprise and superior tactics, they were outmatched. She called a meeting with her staff and explained that conventional warfare would not win this fight. They needed to do something the Council would never expect, and make them react instead of acting according to their own plans. Lisa proposed a strategy, so risky that several of her officers thought she had lost her mind, but Jake approved it because desperate times called for desperate measures. Nicole Sanders worked with Corvani intelligence agents to prepare a propaganda campaign that would be deployed during the battle. They had recordings of Council atrocities and testimony from species that had suffered under their rule. If the Alliance could broadcast this information widely enough, they might convince some Council forces to defect, or at least hesitate when ordered to kill civilians. It was a long shot, but every advantage mattered when you were this badly outnumbered. The Council fleet arrived at Zentara 3 days before the Alliance was fully prepared. Mordax had been given overall command again, and he was determined to redeem his failure at Earth. He broadcast a message to Zentara demanding they surrender the human forces or face total destruction. The Zenthari government responded by evacuating their cities and preparing their people for the worst. Jake stood on the bridge of his flagship and watched the Council forces deploy into battle formation. This was it, and everyone knew that most of them would not survive the next 24 hours. The battle for Zentara Prime began at dawn on the planet's surface, though in space there was no day or night. Jake Morrison stood on the bridge of his flagship and looked at the tactical display showing 2,000 Council ships arranged in their perfect formations. His 800 Alliance vessels looked pitifully small in comparison, but he had stopped thinking about the odds days ago. He opened a channel to every ship in the fleet and spoke words that he had rehearsed 100 times but still felt inadequate for the moment. He told them that their ancestors had looked at impossible situations and chosen to fight anyway. He said that every species in the Alliance had been beaten down and controlled and told they could not resist. He explained that today they would prove that freedom was worth dying for and that no one had the right to rule over anyone else. Jake finished by saying that win or lose, they had already changed the galaxy forever. The channel closed and he nodded to Lisa Chen, who began executing her insane battle plan. The Alliance fleet did not charge forward like Mordax expected, but instead scattered in every direction as if they were fleeing. Council forces moved to pursue, and their neat formations broke apart as captains tried to chase down what looked like easy prey. Mordax smiled because this was the same tactic humanity had used at Earth, but he had studied those battles and prepared countermeasures. He ordered his ships to maintain coordination and not get separated, but his officers were eager for glory. After their previous defeats, Ryan Torres led a squadron of 50 ships that appeared to be running toward the outer system. 20 Council vessels broke off to intercept them, and Ryan kept transmitting false distress signals to make them think his ships were damaged. When the Council forces got close enough, Ryan's squadron suddenly reversed course and opened fire with everything they had. The surprise attack destroyed 3 Council ships before they could react, but Ryan knew this was just the opening move. The real attack came from an unexpected direction. Danny Sullivan had spent weeks preparing a network of stealth satellites around Zentara that were disguised as space debris. On Lisa's signal, these satellites activated and fired concentrated beams at the Council fleet's rear elements. The Council had been so focused on chasing the Alliance ships that they had not properly secured their flanks. 15 Council vessels were crippled in the first volley, and Mordax realized too late that he had been outmaneuvered. Karen Price watched from her medical ship as the first casualties began arriving. The hybrid shields that Danny had designed were holding better than expected, but nothing could completely stop the Council's weapons. She moved through wards filled with wounded from a dozen different species and tried to save as many as she could. A Zenthari pilot with 3 of his 4 arms missing thanked her in broken English before he died. A human engineer burned beyond recognition asked if they were winning before Karen had to tell him to save his strength. The battle raged for 3 hours, and the space around Zentara became a hell of fire and dying ships. Lisa's tactics were working better than expected because the Council forces kept making mistakes that came from lack of real combat experience. Their captains would pursue damaged ships into traps or break formation to claim individual kills. Jake exploited every error, and the Council casualties mounted faster than Mordax could compensate. But the numbers were still against the Alliance, and slowly the Council's superior forces began to prevail. Jake had lost 200 ships, and the survivors were running low on ammunition and power. He knew they could not hold out much longer, and he began preparing for a final desperate charge that would at least make their deaths meaningful. Then something happened that no one had predicted. Nicole Sanders activated her propaganda broadcast, and suddenly every screen in the battle zone was showing recordings of Council atrocities. Species across the galaxy saw footage of the Council bombing Earth cities and burning rebellious colonies. They heard testimony from survivors who described generations of oppression and casual cruelty. The broadcast reached not just the battle but was transmitted across the entire galaxy through the Corvani communication networks. 3 Council fleets that were composed of member species who had their own grievances suddenly stopped firing. Their commanders had watched the broadcasts and could not continue fighting for a system they now saw as evil. The ships did not join the Alliance, but they withdrew from the battle and refused further orders from Mordax. The Council commander screamed at them and threatened them with execution, but fear no longer worked the way it once had. The loss of 3 fleets changed the mathematics of the battle. Jake suddenly had near parity in numbers, and his forces were more experienced and better coordinated. He ordered a general offensive, and 800 Alliance ships charged directly at what remained of the Council forces. Mordax tried to rally his fleet, but discipline was breaking down as more captains questioned why they were fighting to preserve a system that committed genocide. General Hayes watched from Zentara's surface as the battle turned overhead. Council ships that had been preparing to bombard the planet suddenly found themselves fighting for survival against Alliance forces that had nothing left to lose. He saw one Council vessel break apart under sustained fire from a combined human-Zenthari attack group. Another tried to retreat but was caught by a Dreth swarm that overwhelmed its defenses through sheer numbers. Ryan Torres flew his fighter through the debris field and picked off damaged Council ships that were trying to escape. His squadron had been reduced to 12 vessels from the original 50, but they fought with the desperation of people who knew this was their last battle. Ryan saw a Council ship targeting a civilian evacuation transport, and he rammed his fighter into its weapon array. The impact destroyed both craft, but the transport escaped with 10,000 Zenthari refugees aboard. The turning point came when Lisa identified Mordax's flagship and directed 300 ships to concentrate all fire on that single target. The Council commander's shields collapsed under the impossible barrage, and his ship began venting atmosphere. Mordax sent a final transmission to his remaining forces ordering them to fight to the death, but most of his captains ignored him. The flagship exploded in a fireball that could be seen from Zentara's surface, and the Council fleet broke completely. Over 400 Council ships fled the system through faster-than-light jumps. Another 300 had been destroyed or disabled. The rest surrendered to Alliance forces, and their crews were taken prisoner. Jake sat in his command chair and tried to process what had just happened. They had won against impossible odds, and the Council's military power was shattered. The cost had been terrible, with over 400 Alliance ships lost and hundreds of thousands dead, but they had actually won. President Carter contacted Jake from Earth and told him that the Council's fortress worlds were in chaos. Species across the galaxy were rising up against Council rule, and the ancient government was collapsing faster than anyone had imagined possible. The remaining Council members had fled to their hidden strongholds, and no one knew if they would ever return. Carter said that humanity and the Alliance now had a responsibility to build something better than what they had destroyed. The weeks after the battle were chaotic as the Alliance tried to establish order across hundreds of systems that had suddenly thrown off Council control. Jake was promoted to ambassador and given the task of working with leaders from 37 species to create a new system of government. They met on a neutral station that was built cooperatively by multiple races, and they named it New Horizons. The debates were long and sometimes angry as species with completely different values tried to find common ground. The Xanthari wanted strong protections for individual rights while the Dreth thought in terms of collective good. Humans advocated for democratic representation, but some species had never even conceived of such a system. Nicole Sanders mediated between factions, and slowly a framework emerged that everyone could accept. The new Galactic Charter was based on consent rather than coercion. No species could be forced to join, and no governing body could impose rules without agreement from those being governed. Military forces would be maintained, but only for defense, and each species would contribute according to their ability. Trade and communication would be free and open to all. Most importantly, the Charter stated that no being or group of beings had the inherent right to rule over others. Danny Sullivan worked with engineers from dozens of species to design ships and stations that would serve the new alliance. Karen Price helped establish medical networks that could respond to emergencies across the galaxy. General Hayes trained a new generation of officers who understood both war and peace. Lisa Chen took command of the alliance, defense forces, and made sure that if the Council ever tried to return, they would face a united resistance. Jake stood on the observation deck of New Horizons Station and looked out at space, filled with ships from countless worlds. Young cadets from a dozen different species trained together in the station's facilities, learning not how to conquer, but how to defend freedom. He thought about everything that had happened and all the people who had died to reach this moment. The galaxy faced an uncertain future, but for the first time in 50,000 years, it faced that future as free peoples making their own choices. Dr. Amy Wallace published her final report on the war and the Council's defeat. She wrote that the Council's greatest mistake had been assuming that age and power gave them the right to rule. They had forgotten that freedom was not something granted by authorities, but something inherent in every thinking being. They had believed they ruled everything, but they never understood that no one could truly rule those who refused to be ruled. Jake received a message from Earth saying that a monument was being built to honor those who had died in the war. It would list the names of every human and alien who had given their lives for freedom. Hey,